Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm Brian Murdoch. For show notes, club member bonuses, and more conversations, go to personallandscapespodcast.com. The foreign affairs and travel writer Robert Kaplan sees today's world as a larger version of Germany's Weimar Republic, connected enough for one part to mortally influence the other parts, yet not connected enough to be politically coherent. National disasters like pandemics and recessions spread across a digitally interconnected world beset by urbanization, mass migration, and great power conflict, causing a crisis in one part of the planet to instantaneously become a crisis in all. In his latest book, Wasteland, he uses history, literature, politics, and philosophy to draw parallels between today's challenges and those of Germany's interwar period, giving us a bracing glimpse of a dangerous world that we've already entered into. How did we get here, and where are we going? That's what we're talking about today. Robert Kaplan is the author of 24 books on foreign affairs and travel, including The Revenge of Geography, The Coming Anarchy, and Balkan Ghosts. He's reported on foreign affairs for The Atlantic for three decades, and he was a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and the U.S. Navy's Executive Panel. We spoke about the immediacy of every crisis, how faltering institutions enable fanatics and ideologues, and why the roots of our permanent 21st century crisis continue to lie in what went wrong in the 20th. One quick note before we jump in. I've said before that this podcast is a one-man show. I do everything myself outside my day job, which is writing. But I can't keep funding an unpaid job using what I earn from paid work. The podcast has to become financially sustainable to continue. Many of you write to tell me that you like what I'm doing here. If you don't want personal landscapes to collapse in chaos like the Weimar Republic, then please consider joining my members club. You'll be supporting an independent, ad-free podcast that publishes carefully curated conversations like this one, backed by decades of reading. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com to find out more. And now, here's my conversation on our world in permanent crisis with Robert Kaplan. You use Germany's Weimar Republic as a comparison to the situation we find ourselves in today. And anyone familiar with Berlin is especially aware that Weimar was a period of intense creativity and experimentation, but it was also politically, socially, and culturally unstable. So do those two things always go together? Is a period of intense creativity always marked by political tensions or racial and religious conflict?
Not totally, but what I think is that periods of political instability stimulate artists. They stimulate thinking. The end of the Cold War, which was very dramatic, stimulated a lot of great, a lot of great ideas. The end of history, the clash of civilizations, because it was a time of change. Nobody knew what was coming next, essentially. So I think that artists are stimulated by political instability. I have a book coming out next year on China, not next year in November, on China. And one of the little factoids I have in it is that the very tumultuous anarchic situation in China in the early 20th century stimulated tremendous thought and writing and art and all of that. But what I want to make clear in this book is that people have misinterpreted it. They don't read a book, they see a headline or something. They say Kaplan's, making a link between Weimar and Donald Trump in the United States. But that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm using Weimar in a totally different context. How the collapse of distance has made our world like one big Weimar, whereby there is no, there's a crisis everywhere. We're always in some breathless crisis. And that's what Weimar was like. But this world is not leading to another Hitler. I make that clear in the book.
This ability of one crisis to cascade to another, and for a small crisis in one part of the globe to affect just about every country and every region of the world, is that an unintended consequence of globalization or just an outcome of technology?
I think globalization itself is an unintended consequence of much because, globalization, I remember very vividly the early 1990s, when I was writing books and reporting, and everyone thought globalization was really, I wouldn't, the end of history. I don't mean it as a pejorative to Fukuyama, who wrote a great book, actually. But they really thought that, now there's peace on earth, there won't be other wars, everyone's gonna get along, we're gonna have similar cultures, and globalization wasn't a security system. It was just a phase we were passing through of a world more united due to American management techniques. Corporate boards had people from all over the world speaking different languages on each corporate board, and borders came. It was easier to travel. The world was shrunk, not defeated by technology. But I think the end result is, as I point out in Wasteland, is that globalization, rather than unite the world, is just splitting countries down the middle. It split the United States, Britain, France, other countries down the middle between the haves that are globalized and the have-nots who have not joined into the whiskey sipping, wine tasting, European vacation oriented fun.
You point out that one of the greatest current challenges in this period that we're in right now is the immediacy of every crisis, and exactly what we're talking about now, not just local crises but global. And when you connect that with our constant obsession, this constant obsession with the immediate, with our focus on short-term election cycles in the West,
Oh.
it seems that we're rarely ever ahead of events. Like we're increasingly unable to set the agenda, or we're less and less willing to.
Yes, we're afflicted by presentness, is as I would call it, because of the vividness of the media, the vividness of digital communications, of videos. The present moment takes over completely, and we lose our sense of the past, and we're oblivious to the future, so to speak. So there's very little historical thinking. The only thing that matters is the present news cycle. Yeah, in many people's mind. And this hurts analysis because the whole point of analysis is to see beyond the news cycle, so to speak, to get a sense of where things are going. And that's less and less the case here.
You've got a great quote in the book describing the situation. You say, whole populations in the grip of some political frenzy or other, tapping feverishly on their smartphones in unison, their approval or disapproval, will increasingly resemble the mores of teenage girls, in which the worst fear will be that of ostracism. It's really alarming when you think that this short-termism, this obsession with the present, pair that with our increasingly post-literate society and the removal of things like classics
Yeah.
from the curriculum because the world that those writers lived in doesn't match the progressive values of today. This obsession with the present moment blinds us to the lessons of the past and dooms us to repeat those mistakes. Like we lose sight of the inherent tragedy of human existence.
Yes, exactly. Where again, this loss of any sense of where we've been, essentially. And if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going, and you can't plan for it or anything like that. I mean, books never used to be part of the media. A publication strategy, a publicity strategy for a book used to have, in the 80s and 90s, not much to do with the general media or with the current news cycle at the time. Now it's totally dominated by the news cycle. If the book doesn't fit in with the news cycle, the book doesn't do well, and so it becomes a crapshoot. In other words, and an author gets lucky or unlucky the way it, and this occurs with everything, so to speak. It's digital. America was a great mass democracy during the print and typewriter age. In a digital video, social media era, I'm not convinced that the US has a bright future as a mass democracy. It's gone through transitions in the past, but I'm not so sure if it'll have successful transitions in the future.
Well, you wrote in the book too that leadership is vital to a great power or empire. It constitutes the Shakespearean element that ultimately eclipses the vast impersonal forces of geopolitical and economic fate. So is this why we're seeing such a dearth of leadership since the end of the Cold War? That we've shifted from this print and typewriter age into a
Yeah,
world that
I
rewards
think
emotion?
it's really astounding. If you look at the group of American presidents from Truman to George H.W. Bush, that's the Cold War grouping, and then compare that Cold War grouping to the post-Cold War grouping from Bill Clinton all the way up to the younger Bush to Donald Trump, you see a dramatic decline in the quality of leadership. Yes, there are some exceptions and some, it doesn't work for every single case in that group, but generally, when you look at it as a group, you see a dramatic decline. And you could say something similar for European countries as well. So what's doing that? Are people just born with weaker characters and become politicians? No, I think politicians have to react to the media. That's the ecosystem in which they operate, in other words. And if the media becomes more superficial because of a change in technology, if a media rewards passion rather than analysis because of the switch from a print and typewriter age to digital video, the quality of leadership is going to go down too. And you see this throughout the West. In other words, think of it. In 30 years, is anyone gonna remember Keir Starmer's name or the name of the Spanish prime minister or the name of, Olaf Scholz, the former chancellor of West Germany, or Macron? These are all forgettable figures, you know? This age of technology has thrown up really forgettable figures. A lot of people, most people maybe hate Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, but they'll be writing biographies of him in 50 years still, because he's not one of these forgettable figures. For a whole bunch of reasons, kind of. And I could also name Putin or Xi or others, but in the West, what we've had due to the social, cultural, technological transition, this new Weimar, is a bunch of forgettable, underperforming leaders.
Or they're memorable for all the wrong reasons. Like my country elected Justin Trudeau. Seriously, they're one of the least serious of world leaders. But so I wonder too, like this was a brilliant observation I thought that you made about the print and typewriter era, because i these earlier politicians were a product of that, and the current batch of leaders are increasingly the younger ones, products of the social media era. So not just the media landscape changes and the response to the population and the voters changes, but also the way they think changes. Like you pointed out that the
Yes.
the Cold War leaders, many of them experienced the Second World War, so they're much more conservative minded and careful.
They inhabited a world of narrow choices with great consequences because of the nuclear standoff between the Soviet Union and the West. Even in the media, in the early television age, the United States had great television commentators:
Mm.
Walter Cronkite, Eric Sevareid, others. And why were they so great? Because they had grown up and become well known in the print and typewriter age. They were print and typewriter journalists who got scouted to become the stars of this new media called television. But once you had people who grew up in television become the stars, so to speak, they were of a much lower category. If you look at the TV commentators now, for the most part, there are exceptions, of course. They're of a much lower quality than in the early television age, because the early television age got its stars from the print and typewriter age.
It's very interesting. Another thing that really stood out for me in the book, you mentioned the steep decline of institutions. and the role that the lack of strong institutions played in places like post-Soviet Russia. And I look back at Canada and at Germany, where I recently lived, and I also see a steady breakdown in the sort of behind-the-scenes underpinnings of our civilizations, like things like basic infrastructure. We can't seem to get anything done anymore. From building an airport in Berlin in that's 10 years overdue to just fixing a bridge or simple breakdowns. Like what?
Yeah, and it's afflicted the US military because it could take 15 years to design and build a fighter jet, and by the time it's built, it's already obsolete or semi-obsolete. And meanwhile, there are these new startup powers that can just be producing drones and everything that can take out a US military target of a much bigger and much more expensive vintage, so to speak. So it's up and down the case. So I this is common to, this all goes back to Ibn Khaldun, as I say, as I say in the book. It goes back to, when civilizations become mature, they become wealthy, they become bureaucratized, and they become decadent. And then they're replaced by new civilizations or new tribes in Ibn Khaldun's formulation. He was a 13th century North African Arab philosopher and historian. And and we're in a state now of a very calcified bureaucratic regimes where it's very hard to get things done. Meanwhile, startup powers can just build stuff, so to speak. You even see the difference not only between countries, but within states in the United States. For instance, Texas, where I am for the moment, is a much more dynamic place than Massachusetts, where I live, because it's newer. It's newer, and they have to build a new interstate. They do it. They don't do 1,000 different environmental impact statements before they can build it. They just start digging it and building it. And that's the case in China, in the Arabian Gulf, where things get done and get built, and that's a threat.
Well, that is one thing that does give me some hope for the states is that various states are existing in very different degrees of this sort of collapse, and things seem to shift to the states where opportunities are and where the roadblocks are removed. Like Texas seems to be the current place that people are fleeing California or these other states to go there. Canada doesn't seem to have this.
California used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, California used to be the place where the future was. Now Californians and companies are moving to Texas, essentially.
So will this provide a bit of a buffer to a place like the U.S. where these other regions start to take
Well,
the
in a
lead?
way it does, because the US, remember the name of it, it's the United States. It's plural, you could think of it in plural almost, So you have 50 states, all very different, all in different stages of development. And and an experiment in one state that works could be copied by other states. So it's part of the mix of American dynamism, is the fact that you don't just have federal, but you have state power, and you have states with real identities, which often is not the case, in many other countries. But generally, I'm not so sure the US is going to make this transition, because as I said earlier in the interview, the transition was made. I mean, the greatness of the mass democracy of the United States was made in one era of technology, and different eras of technology bring out different sides of countries' personalities and various things.
Speaking of bringing things out, that's another point that you made in the book that really stood out for me. You said that there are large, overwhelming forces of geography, culture, and economics, and there are also contingencies based on pivotal personalities, and history blends the two. I think most listeners are obviously familiar with pivotal figures like Churchill or Napoleon, but you also pointed out the outsized role of fanatics and ideologues, and how figures like that seem to arise or to succeed when institutions break down.
Yes. The world, some philosophers, others have said that the world is becoming more civilized, less violent, people on the whole. One writer even said that the world is becoming more feminized. There's less overt hate and all of that. Well, there are two problems with that. One is, as you alluded to, as I point out in the book, there will always be individuals who will revolt against that, who will revolt against the new conformity. In other words, fascism was really a revolt of the bullies. It was like glorifying the bully mentality. That's what fascism was originally about. And fascism was led by a few men, who went against the grain of where things were developing. So there's there's the revolutionary chieftain, the individual like Hitler or someone else. And then there's the other thing that conformity can lead to decadence, can lead to what the early 20th century Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset said was the man who knows his narrow slot of existence, an expert in a narrow range of expertise, but is ignorant of everything else in the world. And those periods can lead to all kinds of instability.
So how is urbanization making this worse?
Urbanization is intensifying the present moment. It's intensifying geopolitics. Why are geopolitics so intense where we go from crisis to crisis? Because technology has defeated distance. And so any part of the world can ignite a geopolitical crisis that affects another part of the world as never before. The US Civil War killed about 600,000 people. I think there are over a million or several million people killed in the Taiping rebellion in China at the same time, but nobody knew about it because there was no technology to unite it. Now everything is known. So that intensifies geopolitics. Also, we experience geopolitics through the digital video age media. These video clips you see in intense, in very intense vividness when you go to the homepage of the New York Times or other things like that. It's not just something we read about. So we react emotionally strongly, and that leads to further instability in geopolitics. And urbanization is an intensification of all of this. In other words, because urbanization encourages groupthink because people live close together. It encourages, you need more infrastructure for urbanization. So if things go wrong, it's even worse. And social media and urbanization go together. In other words, they feed off each other to provide a more intense experience of the present. Like if you look at the Gaza war and the images coming out on it and the extreme reactions in the West, you could take a step back and say, there's been conflicts with equal amount of bloodshed in the Middle East going back a long time. It didn't excite the West as much or students in the West as much. And what I'm saying in this book is it has something to do with technology,
Yeah,
with
and
communications
as
technology.
well as technology's the advantage it gives in controlling the narrative. You really see that playing out here because in the Second World War, the Nazis launched a war of aggression, and cities like Berlin were completely bombed to oblivion, and nobody was saying stop the poor Germans. It was seen as a consequence of picking a fight that you didn't win, kind of thing. But you're not seeing that now. It's totally skewed.
Everything is a narrative. Everything is a narrative. That's true. And that, we really live in a media age. The media is the dominant power, and that's not a good thing. You know, that's not a good thing because ultimately the media is it's not accountable. It's not accountable except for profits, except for how many eyeballs it has. And social media, for instance, you have these influencers with extreme views, really extreme, horrific views, who have millions of followers in the United States. You never had that before. Because before, to influence people, you had to have an expertise. You had to, a written news article had to be fact checked. It had to be in the political center. All of that is gone now.
We're also seeing the complete dissolution of the barrier between news and op-ed. So everything is that neutrality isn't a thing anymore.
Everything is an opinion. Everything is opinion. Yes, you do. Yeah. You really see that. You can really see it through the evolution of the New York Times, because the New York Times used to have an op-ed page. It always did. And everything that was not on that one op-ed page was was an article so balanced that you could not tell how the writer voted, you know? Essentially. Now you have opinions and what they call analysis that are really opinions all over the paper, or all over the website, I should say.
And you wrote very vividly in the book as well how almost the culture of social media sets the agenda at a place like the Times, where social media outrage
Yeah.
spirals over to the point where they can fire the.
Yeah, I dealt with first of all, the New York Times is like the greatest business model anyone could invent, because its real audience is not the United States, it's the global elite. That's its real audience. Like, it refers to Americans in the third person, so to speak, or it seems to. It doesn't, but it seems to. It's a great business model. It's almost like an intelligence factory, because it produces these detailed investigative reports on everything from climate to soil in Africa to just you go through the Times for a year and you see it's just amazing what they do, but they have a point of view, that they have a point of view, and they have evolved into this point, into this point of view. Whereas, the Times has moved gradually to the left, and where the Times used to have a great executive editor in the '70s, I believe, Abe Rosenthal, A.M. Rosenthal. And A.M. Rosenthal said that, "Look, the reporters write from a little bit to the left, and I have my editors edit a little bit to the right, and the result is we get a balanced paper." You know what I mean? That world is gone. It's dead, essentially.
Yeah, technology has completely undermined moderation in the sense that our ability to find a workable modus vivendi, and doesn't seem to be going away. Things have completely the center has been abandoned almost, and things are either one side or
Yeah,
the other.
yeah.
And you wrote about this, the possibilities, because every place is strategic, the possibilities of conflict become more numerous than ever. So the First World War was the first industrial war, and World War II was a total war in which civilian cities became legitimate targets, as we just said. So we should expect this to continue then, and that technology will become a natural extension of geopolitics. Like the integrated network itself becomes another zone of conflict.
Yeah, exactly. And also, this is a key thing that I say in the book. All three great powers are in decline. You know, the United States, I believe, is in decline. I've alluded to why. Russia is in decline because the longer the Ukraine war goes on, the weaker Russia becomes in the Caucasus, Central Asia, Siberia, and the Russian Far East. And China, I think, because of the extremity of its rule, a real Leninist autocracy, is really in the last phase of communism. And what replaces it, remember, communism is just another Chinese dynasty. What replaces it may be very, very different. I mean, this is another case of we're so obsessed with the present with Xi Jinping, we can't see beyond it. And Xi is in his 70s, Putin is in his 70s. Trump is not going to be around forever, so to speak. So the world is going to go through a tremendous transition that in many ways is unpredictable in the years to come. And then there's India, which I don't talk much about in the book, but I mention it here and there. India is obviously the world's primary pivot state. Whichever way India goes affects geopolitics dramatically. But India still, to an extent, has been living on hype because it has vast numbers of young men without jobs and it's a lot less stable in person when you go into the heart of India than you read about with news headlines. It's unclear that India for a long time will have the capacity to project power the way the Chinese do.
So, what do you think will happen in China? Because anybody who's read a bit of Chinese history knows that each time a dynasty comes to an end, there's a period of civil war or total collapse before the next dynasty replaces it. Do
Yeah.
you see something like that?
That Look, anything is possible. Anything is possible. I if she's going to be replaced, there's no sign of it at the moment. The signs are that he's filling the bureaucracy with people who think like
Mm.
himself, in other words. But nevertheless, as he ages, there will be different tendencies and cliques will come to the fore and develop that could provide a framework for a new and different China to emerge. That's not an odd event. That's a very natural, organic event. That's what should happen actually. But China, to an extent, is a black hole because, for instance, just 3 weeks ago or so, Xi Jinping fired his military chief. And there were all these learned analyses in foreign affairs, foreign policy, the New York Times, by real experts. And what struck me is that they all disagreed with each other. There was no real consensus, which to me means they don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes there.
I suppose the one big difference between China and Russia is that China has strong institutions.
That's what I point out in the book. Yes, that if she were to get sick tomorrow, deathly ill tomorrow, China wouldn't collapse. China has a standing committee, it would elect a leader or would elect a group of leaders and it would govern. It might change dramatically. It might have some short-term instability, but China would hold together. You cannot say the same thing about Russia because Russia has always been weakly institutionalized throughout its history. Even the czars had very little control of what went on in the hinterlands, so to speak. And so if Putin were to get deathly ill tomorrow, it's unclear what or who would replace him because he more or less governs through like concentric circles of oligarchs and crime figures and intelligence figures. And he's committed a great blunder in this Ukraine war, but nobody could replace him. Perhaps because nobody wants his job, that when he goes, the system may collapse. You may have, like, as I point out in the book, a kind of low calorie version of the former Yugoslavia.
So I want to bring us back to history. You said in the book that though technology has kept evolving, the roots of the permanent crisis in the 21st century continue to lie in what went wrong in the 20th. In what ways is that? Is that because the world wars wiped out stable institutions like monarchies?
This is the legacy of communism too,
Hmm.
as I that communism existed in Russia, in the Soviet Union, as it was called during the communist decades, for 70 years. That's a long time. That's a long time. And and unlike traditional authoritarian right-wing regimes, a very hard left regime, affected every aspect of life all the way down all the way down the line. And it did tremendous damage to Russian political culture. And I think that Putin, though he is nominally a post-communist, his rule, his style of rule, his absolute aversion to any humanity is really still the problems of communism going back to 1917. Let me put it this way. Had Lenin and Trotsky not been successful in what was then really a coup d'etat in toppling Tsar Nicholas II, and had they not been successful and the czars were able to remain on the throne, eventually they would have become constitutional monarchs, and Russia would have been corrupt, a bit unstable, not of the quality of government of Central Western Europe, but you wouldn't have had tens of millions of people murdered. It wouldn't have been that catastrophe. And the same I could say about Iran. Had the Shah stayed in power in 78, 79, he would have liberalized, he would have become more of a constitutional monarch, and Iran today would be like South Korea. Instead, it's a basket case. It's destroyed the middle class. It can't even provide water or electricity for its people.
So you wrote that it's a conceit of the modern world, and particularly of the West, that history is governed by reason. Why do we get that so wrong? Is it because as humans we use stories to make sense of the world?
Yes, Tolstoy had a way of putting it. He said, It's impossible to know why events could happen because he calls it billions. That's the word he uses in War and Peace. There are so many billions of factors that go into each great historical event that it's just, you have to stand in awe of history. You can't try to explain it. In other words, like he said, Napoleon had a head cold at the Battle of Borodino. Had he not had a head cold, maybe the French would have performed better because his quality of thinking would have been better and they wouldn't have invested Moscow like they did. He goes along in this train. And because because all you can do is stand in awe of it, what Tolstoy says is what historians do is they work backwards and they provide a cause for each event so it all seems logical at the end, while in the moment of it happening, it was impossible to know which way things would go.
So you've talked in the book also about the illusion of knowledge among elites, and in particular, all those confident pronouncements you mentioned earlier that the world was on the verge of democracy everywhere. And anyone who has traveled even a little bit knows that that's just a pipe dream, that democracy will not come to some of these countries probably ever. And that's something I've always liked about your work, that since I first read you 30 years ago, is that you're a traveler with firsthand experience of the places that you write about. So how important do you think it is to go on the ground and see these places for yourself and describe what's happening there?
Well, as I said, the world is shrinking because of technology, and more places are more or less similar, more similar than they were 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, more similar than they were 60 or 70 years ago. Now it's almost impossible to go to the most far reaching places without crowds of tourists, and, in many cases. But I still think there's a lot to be said for being on the ground. The hardest thing, the most dangerous thing sometimes a writer can do is to describe what he actually sees in front of his face. Because what he actually sees or experiences in a local place will go against the thoughts of liberals, neoconservatives, what have you, because they all have this very structured view of how the world works. And the world is too messy for that.
Yeah, I think you said it best in the book, where the problem with predicting the future is that it usually descends into linear thinking, the mere extension of current trends. And I like
Yeah.
how you quote Paul Theroux from his Last Train to Zona Verde, where he said, my feeling has always been that the truth is prophetic. And if I write accurately about the present, seeing things as they are, aspects of the future will be suggested.
That's absolutely true. You know, the times when I've gotten the future right was not when I was trying to be a futurologist. It was when I was just reporting on the present in a place that other people ignored, you know? So I was doing my job as a reporter in the Balkans in the 1980s that made me a bit prophetic about the 1990s. And I was doing my job in West Africa in the early 1990s, which made me a bit prophetic about West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa in the late 1990s and on. It's not about predicting the future. It's just about being a reporter or a traveler and, and describing what you see in front of your face.
Another thing I really like about your work too is that you look to writers who were on the ground at the time and not just journalists. You said that in the guise of fiction, a writer can more easily tell the truth. So how important is fiction as a source of information for you in terms of your
Oh,
work?
it's very important because in the guise of fiction, a writer can hide behind his characters. He can say, "Well, I don't believe that, but my character does," you know? And that way, a fiction writer can be very politically incorrect and get away with it, in a sense. And also another thing, and this also goes back to Tolstoy. A fiction writer uses his or her imagination. Tolstoy said, again in War and Peace, that it's not enough to know something analytically, that there could be a revolt or a revolution or an invasion. It's not enough to know that analytically. You have to be able to vividly imagine it actually happening. And that's something so a fiction writer can bring imagination to events and can write and doesn't have to worry about right thinking, about correct thinking, because he can hide behind his characters and hide behind the plot, in other words.
Yeah, I think it also reveals sort of the underpinnings of a culture, the unspoken assumptions that people don't talk about. You kind of see the water that they're swimming in by reading a fiction writer from a place as well. You get a sense of how the culture influences thinking.
Yes, exactly. I think the one of the most important fiction writers today alive is Amitav Ghosh, who I've always championed because what things he's writing about is migration. You know, that's the world we live in today. It's about migration. So, he about the environment, threats to the environment, that's the world we're living in today.
So I know our time is limited, so I want to wrap up with one last question. You said the earth is vast enough so that no individual political force can really dominate it. So we're forced to wallow in one sort of emergency or another without pause as crises seep and ricochet across the globe. So is this our permanent condition now? And is there any way out of it short of some authoritarian global government?
No, I don't think there is a way out of it. You put your finger on it. Any global government would, by very definition, have to be authoritarian because not all of us on this earth do not agree on basic things. So the idea of a world body is essentially authoritarian, in that sense.
I guess we're in for interesting times. Thank you for your time tonight, Robert. I've been reading your work for 30 years and have benefited enormously from your insights. And it's been a great pleasure to introduce Wasteland to my readers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. And please consider joining my members club on Substack. You'll be supporting an independent, ad-free podcast that publishes carefully curated conversations like this one, backed by decades of reading. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com for details.